I've been focusing on data pedigree and provenance. I'm not going to get into what those terms are. They're used differently by different organizations. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I'll give you some of my experience and what brought me to this area, and looking at that along with some other colleagues, Robert Lario, who also co-chairs this group. But about 5 years ago or so, Robert and I started working on a project for the National Geospatial Agency in the US around updates to nautical charts. Right? It's a maritime safety issue. There was a tremendous backlog at NGA to get updates processed to update those charts and get them out. And it turns out to be a rather complex problem, right? So you have ports around the world. The hydrographic offices that are responsible for updating charts in each of those jurisdictions put out their own, what are termed notices to mariners. And those have all the chart updates for their charts. So NGA doesn't go and look at those specific ports. Some of them they do, but others they don't. They get updates from other hydrographic offices. So for instance, we get them from the UK, we get them from China, lots of hydrographic offices around the world. And those notices come in various languages, and they overlap in the areas that they talk about. So for instance, we get updates from the UK and from China about Hong Kong. So the question for the NGA is, okay, we've got these, are they consistent? Do they both say this buoy is at this spot and it's blinking red on the top? Or is it slightly over? Or is it blinking a different rhythm, right? Different frequency. So you process those, and if they're different, the question is, which one do I believe? How do I know which one of these updates to actually make? And there are lots of issues around that. Do I trust China or not, right? We don't know. We might in some areas, we might not in others. When we get those updates from China, as an example, we have to translate them. Was the translation done correctly? So it's not even an issue of whether or not we trust the hydrographic authority that we get the information from. If we have to process it, did we process it correctly? Were there any errors potentially introduced when we did that? So now we're talking about where we got it from, the origin of the information that we're looking at. We're talking about who gave it to us, what we did with it. If we got it from a third party, did they do anything to it, right? And so now I need to be able to track, because if I get to the end and I say, oh, there's a problem with this, where in that chain could it have happened? Was it a processing issue? Was it a trust issue with any of the parties along the way, right? How do you process that? Who do we believe? So it turns out to be a fairly complex problem. Here's all the questions. Where did something come from? Do I trust that party, right? How is it produced? Do I trust the process that produced it, whether that was manual or automated? What are the inputs to that process? And what's their lineage, origin, trustworthiness? And back to root nodes, if you will, back to original thing. That's the sort of lineage or origin, right? Then there's the possession, chain of possession, chain of custody, right? Do I trust each of those parties along the way? If we're talking about a blood sample from a cyclist, was the chain of custody of that blood maintained? Was it maintained in the right environment? There are all those issues around physical samples and data as well, right? We need that information because we want to be able to make some reasonable assessment of the authenticity of either a physical thing, if we're looking at that, or data, right? We're here about data. We want to be able to know about the authenticity. And so as we were working on that problem, we started to look at other areas, and the same issues were coming up, right? So it's a broad problem. Supply chain, food safety. I have some more slides on that I'll talk about. Citations, right? Fake news. Where did these facts come from? Do I trust the source of those? Have they been, is it a whisper down the alley thing? I've got some more on that. Electronic health records. I've been working for the past 6 years at the Department of Veterans Affairs in the US. And there are issues around where health information is coming from. So they're in the process of merging the Department of Defense's health record with the VA's health record. And there are regulations around who can see what information based on where it comes from, right? And who has control of that information. We're now talking about a merged electronic health record in some fashion, one record, but bits and pieces of that information are coming from different sources, and that's important. Quality assurance and test data, right? You've got a test machine. It's testing some piece of equipment. It has readings coming off it. Well, that test machine may be different from the test machine beside it. So now if I'm trying to aggregate data, I want to be able to tell, well, now I'm getting, readings coming off a test machine that are outside what I'm, the norm of what else has been happening. Is it because the parts coming that are feeding that machine are bad, or is it because the machine itself is bad? Right? How do we know that? So we want to be able to understand the process. So going into some of these, the food, farm to fork supply chain issue, right? So we have complex supply chains in lots of different industries, right? We're getting tomatoes or spinach from some grower, some farm. It goes through a packing plant, into cold storage, transported through a number of different, organizations and ports, eventually to regional warehouses and distributed out to retail stores so that consumers can, buy it, need it, right? So what happens when something comes up, someone gets sick in some place far from where that was produced? How do we know where the problem was, right? Was it somewhere along the way? It just wasn't stored at the right temperature along the way? Was there a problem in the distribution where it came in contact with other food that was bad? How do we track that? And the problem is large, right? We want to be able to go all the way back to the original source. So that's where we need to get to. And so the issue here is that it's a large-scale federation problem, right? Not just the local area, not just the organizations that ship in our country. It's an international issue. And so it brings up the question of all of this information about provenance and the source and origin and custody, but it has to be shared by all the different organizations. That's the red flag for we need a standard around this so that we can share that information, share the interactions. Opioid addiction, right? I found this out from my colleague. Again, do we trust his information? I do, so I put it in, right? Opioid addiction. We have a serious problem now, and some folks think that the source of that problem goes back to the original citation back in 1980. You're looking at the full, quote, study that was a letter saying addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics. What happened here was a couple of doctors looked at about 12,000 patients that had been in the hospital for various things, had been given opioids as painkillers during a short stay by nurses. They wrote this note, and that's the extent of it, and published it in the New England Journal of Medicine, right? Their conclusion was, hey, narcotics are not an issue in this setting. right? They had no real history. They only had 4 cases of addiction come up out of 12,000. It's not a big deal, right? Well, by 2013, there have been 600 citations of that as new drugs started to come out that were, opioids. And as is said here, right, ultimately cited as an industry study, right? But they failed to mention the fact that it was a very short term. It was administered by a nurse, not people going out and getting a prescription and taking it over long periods, right? And the result is 183,000 deaths. Millions of people are now addicted, right? It's this whisper down the alley. Things turn into new things, and all of a sudden, it's now valid, right? Big issues. So there are, standards are starting to emerge around this. From what we've begun to look at, a lot of different standards are starting to bake some of that information into their standards. So not as sort of a standalone, but as sort of part of the information that they talk about. So one example, right, the HL7's health organization, and they've developed fast healthcare interoperability resources, or FHIR. It's now the big thing in healthcare information exchange. And we work actually very closely with them, by the way. It's a RESTful service for those of you that are into that. There's over 120 sort of complex resources. But when you start to look at it, 25 to 30% of the information in there is about the provenance and pedigree of these of the data, right? So here's a plan definition, and I hope you can all read that. No, not asking you to read that. But there, here's just a couple of examples, right? So here's one big XML thing, and it contains, right, when was this last changed? Who's the name of the publisher, right? Who's putting that out? Who authored the content? Who edited the content, right? Who reviewed the content? Who endorsed it, right? It's not the content, right? It's not the plan definition. It's all about where this came from, who did it, right? It's all about that kind of information. Another example, records management services. I spent 3 or 4 years, about 10 years ago, working with a key thought leader in that industry, one of the authors of the original Department of Defense 5015 standard. And so he had pulled together a number of different U.S. federal agencies to come together and define the requirements for records management. And then he brought those requirements here to the OMG to create a standard for records management services. How do we exchange information in that area? And so we did a lot of work, but for those of you that are familiar with records management, right, custody of records is a big deal, right? And there are, Sarbanes-Oxley and other U.S. federal regulations say that organizations have to maintain records and record schedules. And so that standard, and this is just an example, has aspects of custody and ways to sort of track lineage, sort of partially, right? So, you've got the notion of a provenance association, which has to do with what party, has custody of the records, right? Because you have to have a record schedule, and it might transition from the organization to another organization and finally either be, destroyed or archived for long-term preservation. So there's an aspect there, right? But by the way, it doesn't cover ownership of the record. And those might be two separate things. It's about who has custody. The origin of the record. For records management, those are usually related to the activity that generated the record. And so you want to know what activity that was. You create record categories for that. And then you group together all the records in that category, and then eventually store those as a record set. So there's a way to do that, right? So this would tell us that some record was generated from this activity. It's a pretty skimpy sort of thing about that, but it does provide some of it, right? but it doesn't really talk about sort of lineage of records. So when I have a record, if I do anything to that record, it's now a new record, right? So if you have a document that was signed by one party, that could be a record, and then if it gets signed by another party, that's now a whole new record. It's not the same record anymore. That's how records management works. And the only way to really associate those in that spec, which, by the way, lots of people think this is a good definition for the information in this area. The only way to do that is through this managed record association, and that's not specific. That could be any association. That's not lineage. That's whatever the user happens to want to use, right? So you'd have to know how your organization was going to use this to track that kind of lineage. So again, there's a number of different vertical industry standards that are beginning to include that kind of information, but there's no real standard about just that part alone that you could use, per se. We started to look for those as part of the work we were doing, and we came across the W3C PROV standard, which is a pretty comprehensive standard in the area. It's a lot of good work has been done here, and I'm not intending to go through the whole thing, but just to give you a flavor of what's in that standard. And it has this sort of base model that talks about agents, entities, and activities, right? And so the entity is the thing we care about, right? And that it allows us to say sort of what was the activity that generated the entity? What were the inputs to that activity, right? So now I can talk about processes and entities. I can talk about the agents that were involved. Either I got it from someone, or in this case it's attributed to. If you're talking about citations, article citations, you can attribute it to some source. Entities can be just derived from other entities. You don't really know what the process was, but some document might have been derived from 2 or 3 other documents. So you've got the ability to say that. There's a bunch more to it. You end up with these kind of graphs of where things came from. And so it works pretty well. There's a good bit of work there. It's well documented. But one of the things about this standard is it doesn't talk about custody or ownership. So it's good on the kind of lineage, if you will, and the processing by which things are created and referenced, but it doesn't really talk about custody or ownership. Now, interestingly, you start to look at the definitions of pedigree and provenance, and for the most part, in this domain, those are kind of conflated to the degree of almost everyone, and this specification in particular is just called provenance. Now, in records management, the term provenance really has more to do with custody, which isn't even addressed here. Right? So that's a bit of an issue, and we're not married to any of those terms. We're more interested in the concepts and how they relate to one another, and then sort of finding those terms later on. So who are we, right? Based on that work that I talked about with NGA, we got together here back in 2016 already, a couple years ago, and formed the Pedigree and Provenance Working Group. And we've been working since then. We've reached out to members of a number of different verticals at OMG and outside OMG, and the response was good. It was enthusiastic because it's such a broad problem. So we began to talk to more people. We started looking at the existing standards, and there's a bunch of them out there. I won't go through them. Looking for folks that have been doing research. We came across Dr. Seltzer at Harvard. And we're looking to actually bring her in and give us a talk. We think that'll be really useful. We've begun to capture scenarios and requirements in these different verticals so that we can understand the problem better. As I said, we don't have the answer. We know what we did for NGA and the approach we were taking there, but that may or may not be the best solution to this, right? So as we started to work, over the past couple of years, we started to run into other kind of kindred spirits in related areas like Claude. I was working in data residency. Mike Abramson in information exchange framework. A lot of work's been in that, and lots of aspects of all these areas in that. And an effort in C4I around data tagging and labeling, right? And so we began to see, well, these aren't the same, but they're closely related. And as Claude said, we decided last meeting that we should form a data governance working group, and as he said, we actually chartered that group, approved the charter earlier this week. So we're pretty excited about that, and bringing this all together, we think will help us create standards that are, that work well together, right? We want to be able to, we don't want one sort of uber standard for all this stuff because that's just too hard to create and too hard to maintain, but rather allow us to separate concerns, but have them together in a sort of a well-organized way. And so that's where that's coming from. We've begun a specification for provenance and pedigree to cover these areas, right? Ownership, custody, transformation. I'm specifically staying away from provenance and pedigree. We're going to let people tell us what those definitions should be. Identification of roles in the ecosystem, and services or APIs or whatever you want to call those. I know so is sort of out of vogue, but services for exchanging information about that. And then relation to other OMG or non-OMG specifications. And certainly the PROV stuff from W3C is a big one. We're looking for discussions on a lot of the considerations, right? Granularity. How big are the things that we're tracking the provenance of? If we're tracking documents, okay, that's one thing, but in an electronic health record, right, there's a lot of little bits and pieces, and we need to track those independently. And that can result in a whole lot of volume of data. This is a big data kind of problem, right, and a federation kind of problem. You've got multiple organizations, right? So we've got the VA, and their veterans can go to external providers. So, where's their information coming from? Who was that? Are they getting their drugs, say, from someone else? So now we need to federate all that data, and again, adds to the volume of data, right? There's domain-dependent metadata, and I'm going to speed up so I don't run over, right? Quality assessment, all of this is highly complex. So, we're here for you, right? We're really interested in folks that are out there that are interested in this area. What are you doing? Do you have a problem? Do you have requirements? We'd love to hear about those. Do you have solutions that are working? Or they work somewhat, but they're not quite there, right? We'd really love to hear more from you.